Welcome to Solidarity for Solutions, a podcast by Africans for the Horn of Africa, also known as AFOHA. I'm your host, Bridget Musungu, a researcher with the Africans for the Horn of Africa. I'm also the researcher for Ethiopia and Eritrea, and I also work with Pan-African Lawyers Union. This is our inaugural episode. We hope that this platform will contribute to vital conversations on peace and security in the Horn of Africa. Africans for the Horn of Africa initiative is a coalition of civil society organizations committed to working collectively on crises in the Horn of Africa. This initiative is led by 4 Pan-African organizations, and they include Atrocities Watch Africa, Pan-Africa Lawyers Union, the Africa Leadership Center, and International Refugee Rights Initiative. Joining us today are 2 seasoned human rights practitioners with expert knowledge of inner workings of the African Union. And I would like to introduce them. We have Achieng Akena, who is a Kenyan lawyer and a human rights and democracy practitioner with over 25 years of experience in varied regions and contexts, from Botswana to Afghanistan. Most recently, she has been working on knowledge production, policy advocacy, and capacitation on displacement and migration trends in Africa, including the protection of displaced people and people on the move and durable, impactful, and sustainable solutions for them. And this includes harnessing the dividends of regional integration arrangements. Achieng is a passionate and committed practitioner and advocate with vast experience in regional integration, in the promotion and protection of human rights of marginalized people, and in democratic governance across Africa. She holds a master's in international human rights law from Oxford University in the UK.
Thank you, Bridget.
Welcome, Achieng. With us is also Donald Dare, who's the CEO of Pan-African Lawyers Union and a member of Africans for the Horn of Africa. Mr. Dare is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and was previously the CEO of the East Africa Law Society, and before that, the Deputy CEO of Law Society of Kenya. He has also worked with Kenyan section of the International Commission of Jurists. While at the EALS, he founded the East African Civil Society Forum. Among other things, he chairs the Executive Committee of the Pan-African Citizen Network, PACIN, formerly known as Center for Citizens Participation in the African Union, CCPAU, and the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect. He's a former chair of the African Court Coalition and is also a counselor and former secretary of the Forum of the International Bar Association. He is also a former member of the Executive Committee in the International Institute Law Association's Chief Executives. He litigates extensively at the African Court on Human Rights and the East African Court of Justice. Don has engaged in advocacy with several organs and institutions of the African Union, African Development Bank, African Legal Support Facility, Common Markets for Eastern Africa and Southern Africa, that's COMESA, International Conference on the Great Lakes Region, Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, and EAC, the East African Community, amongst others. Mr. Dare also engages in the United Nations system and the International Criminal Court. Welcome, Mr. Dare.
Thank you very much, Bridget. You're much too kind.
Karibu. Without further ado, I would say we jump into today's conversation. Our topic for today is assessing the effectiveness of the African Union Peace and Security Council in mitigating conflict. And our focus will be on the Horn of Africa. The Peace and Security Council serves as a standing body of the African Union, dedicated in preventing, managing, and resolving conflict. The body was established to a collective security and early warning arrangement intended to facilitate timely and effective responses to conflict and crisis situations in Africa. So our first question will be to you, Dawn. we would like to know, how would you evaluate the performance of the African Peace and Security Council in resolving conflict within the Horn of Africa?
I would say, Bridget, if I were to give the African Union Peace and Security Council a grade out of 100%, unfortunately, the highest I could give them is a 40% at the moment. And even that, I think, is generous.
I think that is generous.
You can say that the Africa that existed 25 years ago, when we had no norms, when we had no institutions, when we had no track record on intervening in peace and security situations of conflict within a country or situations of conflict between countries. And you know that when you look at something like the Horn of Africa, it's a mixture of both. It is really a regional conflict system in which all the other countries are meddling in each other country's affairs in a number of ways. So that we didn't have any tool at all. You can say that between the period 2002 and 2012, the AU went into a deep period of norm setting. It passed all manner of protocols addressing peace and security, addressing women's human rights, addressing corruption, and so on, and setting up institutions. And these institutions began to work. So we do have a Peace and Security Council in Addis Ababa, yes, that meets at the level of the ambassadors, called the permanent representatives, meets at the level of the ministers of foreign affairs when they do meet, and meet at the level of the heads of state. And they have made some impact in some conflicts. In the case of Kenya in 2008, we saw various parts of the AU working well and being able to make meaningful interventions that was able to bring not only peace, but some measure of transitional justice to Kenya. That was 2008. From there on, we've seen the AU make interventions in many other country situations or regional situations. And eventually, in many of those situations, they may even have stopped war. They may even have set up some basis for transitional justice, for recovering after the war. But I don't think that in any of them would you find the citizens of the country giving the AU a thumbs up, or as I said, even the 40% that I gave them. So that should concern us all. One may say, for instance, and that's the last example I'll give at this point in time, that when war began between the national government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Force, TPLF, mostly playing out in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, that eventually it was a platform of the AU that got a cessation of hostilities. So it stopped the most violent phase of the war. That's a plus. But took a whole 2 years to do that, from November 2020 to November 2022. And even then, the cessation of hostilities agreement touches only on certain aspects of the conflict with Tigray, not the grievances in other parts of the country. So it is hard then to get the Ethiopian people to hugely applaud the AU. We are glad it is there, but much, much more can be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Achieng, is it still a 40% from you, considering that they stopped a war in Tigray?
I would think it's more of a 10% for me. And even that 10% I think is generous, principally because even the AU, by its own admission, only ever implements about 10% of its own decisions. That aside, I think the challenge that we have had with the council has mainly been the fact that it was never meant to work alone. The council was always supposed to have an architecture of institutions around it. The council itself is a political, policy-making, decision-making body. So think of it as, say, executive of a government, but it was supposed to have other organs around it that would support and enhance its effectiveness. So, for example, it should have had or rather, it does have, though ineffectually so, a preventative diplomacy wing, which is the panel of the wise, which was supposed to help mitigate conflicts before they actually break out. It has it's supposed to have an early warning, and it does have an early warning mechanism. It has an African standby force, and it has a peace fund. Now, while all these institutions exist, which is why I alternate between supposed to and is, while all these institutions are actually exist, they have been established and they are functional, we never see them come through in situations of conflict on the continent. Let's take a recent example of Sudan and Ethiopia. Yes, the council made decisions, but there was no money to implement those decisions. There was no standby force to maintain peace and security in those situations. The same if we look at Ethiopia, the same if we look at Sudan, the same if we look at Somalia. The council working, just making decisions while seated in Addis, does not have the sufficient gravitas to resolve some of the most complex conflicts that we see happening in the Horn of Africa. So that's the reasoning for my 10%. I think the second reason for my 10%, or my second assessment of the challenges that the Peace and Security Council faces, is that it has 3 different policy-making organs as part of its decision-making processes. So you find that it makes decisions at the level of permanent representatives, which is the PRC. It makes decisions at the level of ministers of foreign affairs, which is the Executive Council, and then it makes decisions at the level of heads of state and government, which is the Assembly. So we have seen situations in the past where the Peace and Security Council at the ambassadorial level will make a decision that does not then get supported at the heads of state level. And so that has in the past affected critically the confidence that one would want to have in the Peace and Security Council. I think the second thing is also, if we look at the current composition of the Peace and Security Council, I would say that a number of countries that have significant challenges with their peace and security situation, or with human rights, are on the Peace and Security Council. I do not anticipate a situation whereby some of these countries would want the Peace and Security Council to have a track record of effectiveness, because that would mean that the Peace and Security Council has to deal with the situations in their particular countries. So if you look at, for example, we now have Egypt, we have, and we know very well what role Egypt is playing in the conflicts in the Horn of Africa. We have Angola, which has its own, extended conflict. We have DRC, which also has its own extended conflict. And so we see a situation whereby countries that are embroiled in conflict, sorry, I didn't also mention Cameroon. So countries that are embroiled in conflict are now supposed to make decisions about other countries involved in conflict. And that is a significant challenge. I cannot imagine, even for myself, being able to make decisions that may work against me in the near future. just one point to add that these countries are also, repeatedly, well, say for Egypt, but the other countries are repeatedly on the agenda of the Peace and Security Council at every summit, every time they come to talk about the state of peace and security in Africa. These countries are countries of concern. And if they're sitting on the Peace and Security Council, I'm not sure how they can actually allow decisions to be made that would make the council more effective in preventing conflict and also mitigating the kinds of conflict that we see happening in the Horn of Africa and in the rest of the continent.
Speaking of mitigation, so that means, prevention, early warning, mechanisms before, there's actually an active conflict. Dawn, would you have any successful examples that instances that the council has successfully contributed to conflict resolution and peace building in the Horn and I guess in Africa?
I would just echo and support what Acheng has said, that the Peace and Security Council is one instance where you can say they've successfully resolved a conflict situation in any one country. But when the African peace and security architecture in its totality has worked on a situation, so it includes the Peace and Security Council, but not only the Peace and Security Council, then we've seen remarkable success. And I'd also like to say that when the heads of state, heads of African member states have made personal interventions, paid personal attention to complex conflict situations, then there has been some improvement, as against when it is just left at the level of ministers, or worse still, just at the level of ambassadors in Addis Ababa or elsewhere. So again, a classical example of when the AU in its totality made an intervention into an African country and caused positive change was Kenya in 2008. We had a situation where there was a disputed election. There had been an outbreak of violence, which was taking on ethnic lines. Some communities were attacking other communities. The police and the paramilitary forces were attacking different communities. The country was sliding into civil war. The ramifications for the neighboring states was beginning to become significant, both in terms of refugee inflows, but also affecting the regional economies, especially of the landlocked states. Things were getting worse. The then chairperson of the AU Assembly, the president of Ghana, John Kufuor, stepped in personally, using his office as chairperson of the assembly. He flew to Kenya himself. He did shuttle diplomacy back and forth in Nairobi between the two key protagonists, President Mwai Kibaki and opposition leader Raila Odinga. He then appointed an eminent panel, and it was eminent. Kofi Annan, who had just retired with quite some honor from the United Nations as Secretary General, Benjamin Mkapa, immediate former president of neighboring Tanzania, which of course is a huge political and diplomatic powerhouse on the African continent, and Graça Machel, who had been First Lady twice in two African countries, but much more importantly, was a senior leader then in the African peer review mechanism. And this eminent panel was backed by its own secretariat, but then had additional support from other member states, from the UN and so on. And this eminent panel was able to get a cessation of hostilities agreement in Kenya within a fortnight. It was then able to get an agreement on DDR, on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of the fighting forces within another fortnight. It was able to get a political settlement that led to a coalition government in less than 2 months. And it then worked over the next 2 years on a range of transitional justice reforms that included a Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission, that included a commission of inquiry into post-election violence, that included a commission of inquiry into electoral malpractices, that included a separate commission of inquiry into restructuring the police and the security forces, and also restructuring land, So all of these events happened within a 2-year period. They were measurable, they were clear, communication with the public was consistent and detailed, engagement of Kenyan and regional civil society was top-notch, and reports were given regularly straight to the AU summit. We saved the country. Unfortunately, for me, that's the last time I've seen in any one country this kind of resolute, step-by-step, comprehensive, whole of AU approach on a conflict. In the conflicts that we've seen, especially the recent ones in the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia, in Sudan, and so on, you do not see an engagement of the heads of state. You see an engagement of special envoys appointed by the chairperson of the commission, not even appointed by the chairperson of the summit, as happened in the case of Kenya. You see them scrambling to get attention of regional heads of state, So you see bureaucrats trying to do their best, if that is their best, at that low level, but not yet a whole of organizational approach, even on something as complex as Sudan at the level of the AU. I grant that in the case of Sudan, for instance, at the level of IGAD has tried to make interventions, including at the level of heads of state. They have not stopped the guns. So we are glad something is happening, people are meeting, but 1 year in, very soon, in less than a month, it will be 1 year since the upswing of the attack by the two major combatants. We have not stopped the guns. Nothing that has been done has stopped the guns. So the success stories are few, but hope, because we have nothing else to hold on to, hope is still high. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. It's good to be hopeful. But Acheng, to dovetail on that point, is there a specific reason when you sort of think and analyze that the Kenya situation is the last sort of quote unquote successful one, and that was in 2008, which is many years ago. Are there any specific nuances or reasons as to why the Horn of Africa, probably the conflicts do not inspire some sort of effectiveness at the council intervention?
I think the dynamics of the region itself, if we just take a map of Africa and look at who is neighboring who. Historically, Ethiopia and Eritrea were in conflict, even though now they have made friends. But then Ethiopia has gone to make friends with Somaliland, and Somalia is upset. So now you have a threatening, at least at the political level, a threatening disagreement between Ethiopia and Somalia. You have had conflict in Libya that has affected the entire Sahel region, which trickles down into West Africa. Now you've had everlasting conflict in Chad. Between Chad and Sudan, for years they have been accusing each other of supporting each other's rebels. Sudan and South Sudan have been accusing each other for years of supporting each other's rebels. You have Somalia, which has been having issues with peace and security for decades. You have South Sudan, which has been unable to stabilize and has been in conflict for the last couple of years, despite the hopes of it becoming a republic. You have Central African Republic, which has also been in conflict for several years, that connects to DRC, that has been in conflict for several years. You have Niger that has just had, has just gone into a coup. And the Sahel belt, where there is a corridor of violent extremism, smuggling of arms and smuggling of people and mercenaries. And you kind of get a very worrying picture about this area. The countries are so interconnected that conflict seems to reverberate from one country to the next. For a long time, Sudan was sort of the bastion of stability, in an ironic sense, because there were obviously issues in the country with each of the regions. There was a semblance of stability because there was a government that was acknowledged by the rest of the continent. And then now Sudan has fallen, and there is no longer sort of, say for Ethiopia, that I think has some troubling issues, and the constant reports of internal uprisings or internal conflict or unhappiness. You basically don't really have a completely stable democracy within that region. And this is a wide region all the way from Libya to DRC, spreading across from Somalia to Niger, and Cameroon also, next to Chad. And how does the Peace and Security Council also prioritize which country it is going to work on? How does it say, okay, because the conflicts are so interrelated and they are so interconnected. So how does the council say that we're going to deal with South Sudan, but not deal with Sudan? Or we're going to deal with Sudan and not deal with South Sudan? So at some level, I'm not sure, but I think there's also a level of intervention fatigue to begin with. Because there's always a conflict that the AU has to respond to. And so they're also very quick for success stories. I would think it's premature to say that the AU resolved the conflict in Ethiopia, because we have had of additional bubblings that are happening in the country. Yes. So it may be premature to say that Ethiopia is completely at peace. But the AU has been talking about developing a lessons learned document for how they successfully resolved the conflict. And that is what makes me think that there is a fatigue of, at least from the AU point of view, of criticism. And so they just want these things to be handled so that they don't have to deal with everybody saying that they have failed, basically, to maintain peace and security on the continent. That just juxtaposed to the fact that there's also a failure in global diplomacy and global governance. We can see the stalemates that have been happening at the UN Security Council. Chapter 8 of the UN Charter requires a devolved sort of response to conflict. So the UN can allow the intergovernmental body that is closer to be able to resolve the conflict. But we have seen that IGAD hasn't been able to resolve some of these conflicts. AU hasn't been able to do it. And there's a stalemate at the UNSC. So what does that mean for countries that are consistently facing particularly cyclic conflict within countries that are facing cyclic conflict? What does it mean for them if there is nobody to offer the kind of support and intervention that Kenya had in 2008? And so I think that maybe what is happening with the Summit of the Futures, where they're looking at rethinking global commitments, global diplomacy, global governance, re-injecting life into why regional integration is important and the benefits that it brings to the actors is maybe a way to support the Peace and Security Council. I don't know. When you speak to members of the AU, they will tell you that, oh, we don't have resourcing. The lack of resourcing is what led to the closure of the AU, body in Somalia, despite a desperate need for it. When we kept asking why they wouldn't send the AU standby force, because it exists, their officers who've been trained to be part of that standby force. And we kept saying, why won't you send the standby force? And they said, well, they don't have the resources. But there is a peace fund and there's money in the peace fund. But there's politics in terms of how to access even that money in the peace fund. And so now we have a situation whereby we have institutional frameworks, I would say multi-million-dollar institutional frameworks that have the mandate, that have the legitimacy to intervene in conflicts, but the internal dynamics just don't work. Every time there's a conflict in Africa, they start appointing, let's appoint a special envoy. I've never had them say, let's deploy the panel of the wise. Maybe they've said it sometime, but I haven't seen it in my following of the AU. They always, for each conflict, they always reinvent the wheel, appoint a new person, appoint a new team. This one doesn't work. Then they'll appoint another one. Then they'll appoint another one. And it's almost, I feel like with every conflict, the AU acts as if it doesn't have an institutional history of conflict resolution. And it does not seem to be building up on the best practice. And so every new conflict that arises, it's like they open a new playbook and they're like, okay, where do we start? Point one, rather than learning from what has happened, what has succeeded and what hasn't succeeded and how they can improve it.
So would you say there's a lack of imagination?
I'd say that there's a lack of consistency. I'd definitely say there's a lack of consistency. There's a lack of harnessing the dividends of what the AU was set up to do and what the AU could actually achieve if each of those mechanisms in the way that they were designed were to be utilized fully towards resolving conflicts on the continent.
Wow. Thanks, Acheng. I would like to give you and Dawn an opportunity to speak about the work that's outside the AU and the Peace and Security Council that enhances the operations of this organ. Dawn, if you're there, we could start with you. You could speak to any advocacy efforts or any efforts by, the larger civil society, any work that Palu is doing as well.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bridget. For me, I think one of the things which we have begun to make a useful impact on Palu as an institution, but much more importantly, in the coalitions with which we work, especially in this case, Africans for the Horn of Africa initiative, is citizen-to-citizen solidarity. We realized that one of the areas where there was a gap is that people in East Africa don't really know what's going on in the Sahel and are not really also plugged on to fellow citizens there. People in West Africa don't know what's going on in the Great Lakes or in the Horn of Africa region, and to begin to, at least reach out, talk to colleagues, find out what is going on, show little acts of solidarity, then begin pushing our various governments all across the continent to be more resolute. So citizen-to-citizen solidarity, making convenings, both in-person convenings and virtual convenings on Zoom, on X, and so on, is something we as an initiative have invested quite a bit in over the last 2 years. And I think it is useful. I think ordinary Africans are getting to know more intimately what's going on in other parts of Africa and to be concerned and to express their solidarity. But apart from that, for organizations such as PALU, in terms of trying to make sure we view to a whole of organization approach to getting the continent to work and to getting the regional economic communities to work, one of the other tools we have used is strategic litigation. So on a whole range of issues, including war, including massive violations of human and people's rights, including rigging of elections or perverting the independence of institutions. Apart from strategic litigation, among other things, we've also tried to engage other parts of the AU, for instance, the Parliament, a very powerful platform, 10 times more powerful than it is right now, in terms of bridging the concerns, the desires, the aspirations of citizens at national level with what is going on at regional and continental level, and in terms of being able to influence the political organs in Addis, or that meet in Addis, that's the Assembly of Heads of State and the Executive Council of Ministers and the chairperson of the AU Commission. PAP can be huge. So despite the various challenges it has faced, we have also invested alongside other organizations, consistently working with the members of Parliament of PAP and with the organs of PAPs, and trying to let them know, bring citizens to them and let them know what's going on in the continent in ways in which they can make resolutions, they can give directives, they can make recommendations, or they can shine light on issues. So those are just some of the examples of the work we tried to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Achieng, if I could give you this opportunity.
I think, like Don has said, very little, and Don knows me, I complain about this a lot. Very little is credited to the role that civil society has played in not just the institutionalization of some of these AU bodies, but also in the operationalization of them. Civil society actors have had communities of practice around the different AU bodies. You have, for example, a very vibrant NGO forum that precedes the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. You have engagements around civil society engagements around the Pan-African Parliament. You have civil society engagements around the AU Summit. And you also have significant African, civil society, African and other civil society engagement around the Children's Committee and the Advisory Board on Corruption. And the significance of this is that not only does civil society play a watchdog role, but civil society organizations have a track record of pushing these bodies to better implement their mandates. And that has been through technical support, through, providing expertise, through providing resources. And I think not much is said about that and about the role that civil society has played in making the AU work better. I think in addition to just the support for the AU bodies, I forgot to also mention that the African Union Commission as well, the Secretariat of the Commission, civil society organizations have had memorandums of understanding where they have provided critical resources and also, just people support to the African Union Commission. And the significance of this is that without civil society and what we have seen, I think Don has a famous quote that I like to requote over and over again, that the engagement, that the results we get from our AU bodies, and I'm totally paraphrasing it now, don't forgive me, but the results that we get from our AU bodies is directly proportional to citizen engagement with them. And we have seen, for example, if we look at the track record of, say, the adoption of treaties, we saw that the Maputo Protocol, that was strongly pushed with very innovative and interesting campaigns by women's rights NGOs, was adopted in half the average time it takes for treaties to come into force, rather than, adoption and then coming into force. So the treaty was ratified in half the time that other treaties get ratified, because there was a huge civil society push for the ratification of that protocol. And also with the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, we also saw that a huge civil society push has made the ratification process go much faster than it usually would. Just to put this into context, there are some AU treaties that have never received ratification for the last 30, 40 years, some even 50 years of their existence. And the other thing that civil society has helped to do is to train additional people who know about the AU, understand the institution, how it works, and how to engage with it. And this commitment to growing the next generation of Pan-Africanists and the next, generation of people who, maybe not. Saying the next generation, I think is maybe not the right way. Maybe saying growing the army of soldiers who keep up this fight is something that cannot be underestimated.
Wow. I feel like this is a great introduction to an even longer series or further discussion on our role as civil society and on the role of this organ and building and being part of the greater architecture to realizing peace and security.
If I were to say three important messages to those that govern various parts of Africa right now, especially various parts of the AU, it would be inclusion, whole of organization approach, and resources. One, inclusion. I think we've laid out some of the benefits of what happens when the people are systematically included throughout in processes, especially conflict resolution processes, but even just state building processes, democracy building processes. We've seen that when conflicts happen and resolution leaves out the people, whatever is put on the table is not good enough. The process by the AU, by the East African Community, and by SADC, amongst others, to try and resolve the tensions in the Eastern DRC and in the Great Lakes region is privileging talking to the heads of state. It's privileging talking to the head of state of Rwanda and the head of state of DRC, and not the people of DRC, for instance, and the people of these other states. That is what should change. The make peace, long-term peace in Sudan is at some point everybody, the UN, the AU, IGAD, and so on, privileged talking to the two armed combatants. So the people dropped out of the table. And now they're stuck with these two combatants who are now belligerent. The people should be on the table all the time. So inclusion for me is important. And then two, as I've said earlier, a whole of organization approach. Let's see what the Assembly of Heads of States and government is doing and saying about let's see what the Peace and Security Council is saying and doing, what the Pan-African Parliament is doing, what the judicial and quasi-judicial bodies are doing. With much more harmonization, we probably get so much more done. We've got a body called the Panel of the Wise. Many times when we challenge them, they say that they do diplomatic behind-the-scenes advocacy or diplomacy, yet we have no knowledge of it and we see no results as such. So they really should think of their communication strategy. We're not saying they have to tell us what they're saying confidentially, but they've got to find ways of letting us know they exist and that they're doing some work and that work is having impact. That's whole of organization approach. The third thing is resources. We just don't have enough resources to make the peace and security architecture work. The AU Commission, the Secretariat, has been stripped too lean. It has very few desk officers trying to cover the 55 countries of geographical of Africa, the 6 regions of Africa, the complex issue. It is just embassies themselves in Addis, the members of the PRC. A lot of the embassies are too lean, especially in terms of having proper departments that focus on peace and security and therefore know the continent well enough. So this needs to change in terms of having properly equipped offices with officers who have the knowledge, skills, experience, and bandwidth to do early action. So those are the 3 things that privilege today. I also agree with you that this was just a first intervention, and we could have further discussions in future where we go deeper into different issues.
I want to just pick up from what Don said about resourcing of the African Union. The conversation on how to resource the Union is one that has been going on for over 2 decades. The African Union began talking about how to self-sustain and finance itself, way back before I started even thinking about engaging with the AU. So that's pre-2008. And by then it had already been on the table for at least 5 years. So let's say from about 2002 or so, the AU has been discussing resourcing itself. And they've had high-level committees, they've had high-level representative, they've had all sorts of people who are talking about resourcing of the AU. And I sometimes have to wonder whether the lack of resources that the AU, the significant lack of resources the AU is facing is out of design rather than because we have a poor continent. And, we can argue back and forth. Maybe that can be one of the topics that we come back to in a later podcast. But I'd like to say that for me, after all the years in which I have followed the work of the AU, understood, how decision-making processes work, followed the summits and the decisions coming out of it, for me, the AU has all the expertise, resources, and even external support to be an effective institution. And sometimes I'm just stumped to understand why that is so. Is it the people who are called to do the work who lack imagination, as you said earlier? Or is it just by design that nobody's interested in the AU being more than a representational, just an effigy of the kind of integration that Africa needs? We must remember our history, that Africa began, as somebody would say, as a commercial project, a European commercial project. And we have had struggles in turning this into a democratic project with nation states. So the question is, how can we build a better regional mechanism that has the gravitas, but also the, not just the gravitas, but also the fortitude with which to resolve the kinds of conflicts that we see happening in the region?
Oh, thanks, Achieng. Actually, that's, I think, part of the why the Africans for the Horn of Africa exists. It's part of the Great African Experiment, that African solutions for African problems. And maybe I can just remind everyone that Africans for the Horn of Africa is an initiative that's a solidarity platform that was established to amplify citizen action and voice in the response to resolution of crises that increasingly plague the Horn of Africa. Given the regional dimension of most of these conflicts, conflicts, as Aching and Don have referred to, it is important that the Africans in the Horn of Africa unite, engage, and collaboratively articulate the necessary policies and recommendations, including what has been provided for by the AU. And these actions, together with governments, national and regional organizations that strive for peace, good governance, and security in Africa. The initiative was born out of recognition of the need to facilitate and strengthen engagement by Africans in ongoing processes. So even us as citizens, we are part of the successes and failures of the AU and its organs. And Africans for the Horn of Africa is seeking to address these conflicts and governance challenges in the Horn of Africa region. And on that note, I would like to thank Achieng and Don Dare for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for taking time off your busy schedule to join us in this conversation. It's one of many, and we hope to delve and demystify these organs so that we can have greater citizen engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bridget, for being a fantastic host.
Well, thank you.
Yes, and thank you very much, Bridget and Acheng.
Thank you for listening to Solidarity for Solutions, a podcast by Africans for the Horn of Africa. We'll meet you in the next episode.